In this lesson, we're going to practice switching in and out of edit mode a little bit more and learn a few key concepts about working between the two modes. First, let's check out a few more features in edit mode. So first, select an object. The default cube here is already selected, and I'll hit Tab to jump into edit mode. We already looked at deleting objects, but we can also delete components in the same way. So similar to deleting objects, we can select something. In this case, I'm in Vertex select mode, so I just left-clicked to select a vertex, and I can hit X to delete, and that'll bring up a menu. So it won't delete it right away, it'll bring up a menu. And if I also hit the delete key, which I'm more in the habit of doing, but either one works, it'll also bring up that same menu. So let's see what happens when we delete a vertex. I'll click on vertices, and not only did that vertex disappear, but all of the edges and faces that were connected to it disappeared as well. And this goes back to what I mentioned in the last video about vertices being the most foundational component in a 3D mesh. An edge is just a connection between two vertices. So if one vertex doesn't exist, then obviously a connection between them can't exist either. In the same way, faces are just connections between edges. And so if an edge doesn't exist because it disappeared because of the vertex, then of course the face can't exist either. That's why deleting a vertex will also delete the edges and the vertices that are touching it. Let's go ahead and delete one more vertex so we can see that again. I'll switch over to Vertex select mode, select this opposite corner, hit delete, and vertices. Now it's left us with just some vertices and some edges and no faces at all. Now I'll hit Ctrl Z a couple times and undo that, so we're back to our default cube. And now let's try deleting edges. Let's go to Edge select mode, select an edge, delete and edges. Since those vertices on the ends weren't deleted, only the connections between them, the faces disappeared, but the vertices remained intact, and so the faces on either side are still there. It's just the one on the top and the one on the side that are gone. In a similar way, we can also delete faces. I'll go to Face select mode, select a face, hit delete, and go to Faces. What's interesting about this is that it also deleted one of the vertices as well. I'll hit Ctrl Z so we can see that again. If I go to Vertex select mode, you'll notice we have a vertex in the top right of this face. But if I delete this face, which I can also do the exact same thing just by selecting all of the vertices of the face and hitting delete and faces, then that vertex disappears because it's the only face that it's attached to. If that vertex was attached to any other edge or any other face, then it would stay put. But because it was only attached to that face, then when we deleted the face, it also deleted that vertex. This may take a little bit of time to get used to if you're coming from other software, but don't worry, you'll pick it up really quickly, and I found it to be a really fast and flexible way to work. If you wanted to delete this face, but actually keep that vertex, what we could do is use our delete menu again, go to delete, but this time use only faces. Now it's deleted just the connection between all of these vertices, but it's actually left the edges and that vertex in the corner. I'll hit Ctrl Z and undo that, and this time I'll choose only edges and faces. So now it'll just leave the vertex. It's also deleted all of the connecting edges, which meant that the adjacent faces have also disappeared. Don't worry, you won't be using those two options too often, but just for now, get comfortable with deleting vertices, edges, and faces. One thing I'd like to point out is that if we go to Edge select mode here, from now on I'll just do it by pressing 2 on my keyboard instead of using the top buttons, you'll notice that our vertex disappeared because we're only viewing edges at the moment. And so we can't actually see that we have a vertex over here floating in space. That's because vertices have no actual size. They're just a representation of a single point in space. In the same way, edges are infinitely thin. I'll go ahead and hit Ctrl Z and undo this and get back to our default cube. Once you've gotten some practice with deleting things, let's go ahead and start adding things as well. Actually, before we do that, I want to show you one more thing about deleting, and that's if we delete everything. Remember, the hotkey to select everything is A. So I'll select everything here with A. I'm in Edge select mode, but I can still delete all of my vertices just to get rid of the entire mesh all at once. So I'll hit delete and go to vertices. Now my object is completely gone, right? Well, not actually. Our object still exists. We just deleted all of the vertices in our mesh that's in our object. We can actually still go into object mode by hitting Tab, because we're still in edit mode here, and we'll see that our cube is still in the outliner. And if we hit G and move our invisible cube around, or our invisible geometry, because there's nothing there, we'll just see this little orange dot move around. And that's called the object origin. And as the name implies, it's the center of our object. We can still scale it, rotate it, and move it around. And even though we won't actually see any visible change, because of course there's no mesh in this object, it's still an empty container, and the container still exists. For now though, let's reset this object origin back to the center of the scene. Do you remember how to do that from a previous lesson? We can do it by clearing the location. Since we use G to move, we can use Alt-G to clear all of the movement. So I'll hit Alt-G and bring that back to the center. And since I may as well also clear all of the rotation and scale as well, I'll hit Alt-R and Alt-S. Again, you can see everything I do on my keyboard in the bottom right as I do it. So now that we've learned that we can have empty objects and that we have an object origin, which is the center of our container here, let's go back into edit mode and add new geometry. I'll hit Tab, and we can add with the same hotkey that we used in object mode, or use the Add menu. But we'll only see the mesh primitives because of course we're working with a mesh object. So I'll hit Shift A, and we can add a cube. And let's also add another object as well, just for fun. So I'll hit Shift A, and let's add a torus. By default, it becomes the one that's selected, so I can easily hit G and Z to move it along the Z axis, and just place it on top of our cube here. Let's say we have a couple other pieces to this mesh as well. Maybe we want our cube to be sitting on the floor. Well, we need to select everything with A. I'll go to 1 on my number pad to go to front view, hit G and Z to move this up along the Z axis, and this time I'll add a plane. Shift A, plane, and then immediately, since everything is already selected, hit S to scale. I'll scale that up, and now let's look at this in object mode. I'll hit Tab to switch from edit mode to object mode, and now we can see that all of these components, which we could have made as separate objects, are now all just one object called cube. You might be wondering at this point whether you should create shapes in object mode or edit mode, and while on some level it doesn't necessarily matter, I would recommend, at least for now, starting out with creating your shapes in object mode. But we'll talk a lot more about this in the Fundamentals of Mesh Modeling course. For now, let's learn how to separate out these pieces though if we want to later make them separate objects. I'll hit Tab to go into edit mode, and first let's separate out this torus and make it its own object. To do that, I need to select all of the components on this, either all of the edges or all of the faces or all of the vertices. I'll go to Vertex select mode here, and we could go through and individually select all of these just by shift and left clicking on all of them, or we could try to box select all of them and not box select anything on the cube or the plane, but that would be incredibly tedious. So instead, we're going to use a command that's going to select everything that's connected to whatever we already have selected. So since I've selected some vertices on our torus and nothing on any of the other parts of the mesh, then I can go to the Select menu, go down to Select Linked, and choose Linked. The hotkey for that is Control-L. So now we have only our donut selected and nothing else, and the key to separating it is just to go to the Mesh menu, down to Separate, and choose Selection. Now we're still in edit mode on the original object, but it separated out the new object and bumped it out of edit mode. In the outliner, you can see it's called cube.001. Let's rename it to something a little bit more appropriate. So I'll double click it, and I'll call it Ring. Now let's separate out the plane from the cube. I'll just select one part of the plane, and in this case it's super easy to select all 4 points, so let's just do that. And then I can go to Mesh and Separate, and choose Selection again. Or we could use the hotkey P as noted here on the right side of the menu. Alternatively, we could have done by loose parts here at the beginning, just because none of them are connected by any edges or faces. But for now, let's use our hotkey P and choose Selection. Then I'll jump into object mode by hitting Tab, and now we can select these 3 independently. And I'll double click on the cube.001 name. We can see that that's the plane, so I'll rename it to plane. So we can separate objects, but we can also put them back together. And to do that, we just need to join them. So if we wanted to join our plane back into our cube, I just need to select one, and then shift select the other one. Remember the idea of the difference between selected and active objects. So right now the plane is a selected object, but the cube is the active one, and that means that the plane is going to be joined into the cube's mesh data. Again, you can always make sure that something is the active object by selecting it last. So to join things together, let's go to Object and Join, or use the hotkey Control-J. Great, so now we have a floor with our cube that we can work with separately from our ring here on the top. If you start working with these objects though and start transforming them, you might notice something a little bit weird when it comes to our ring. If I hit R to rotate, instead of rotating from the center of the mesh like it's done with pretty much all of our other objects, it's rotating from this point here in the center of the scene. That's that object origin that I was talking about earlier. If I hit G and start to move this object, I'll move it off to the right here, you can see that little orange dot follows along. Again, that's what Blender thinks is the center of our object, which is just a container for our mesh parts inside of it. So all of the transformations that we do here, if we hit S to scale, it'll scale it down to that point. If we hit R to rotate, it'll rotate around that point. Everything we do is going to be based around that object origin. So it's really, really important to be aware of where that is in relation to all of your parts of your mesh, because if we, let's say for example, we go into edit mode here, if I hit tab and then select everything with A and move this way off to the side, you can see how if I have this, maybe sitting on top of a shelf somewhere way over there, and I go into object mode and start to try to rotate it, this could get very confusing very quickly. So one thing that you always want to try to do is to keep your object origin in a pretty sensible place when you're working in edit mode. So one thing that we could do here is try to move it back to our object origin. I could hit G and move this back to our little orange dot there. I'll hit 1 to go into front view. Since it's kind of hard to place things perfectly in perspective mode, I'll hit 3 to go to side view. Move it along the y-axis here. Again, I know that I need to move it along the y-axis because I'm looking at the green line here at the bottom, and also I can see the y-axis is the right direction here in the gizmo on the top. Now if I hit tab to go to object mode, hit R to rotate, this rotates a lot more like what I was expecting. Now if for whatever reason this object origin gets way off, there's also a way to change where it is manually. We just need to go to object mode, go to the object menu, and go to set origin, and choose any one of these options. Usually I'll either use origin to geometry or origin to center of mass, which will just calculate the center of the object and put it there. In this case, let's just use origin to geometry. And it just jumped a little bit because it was already there. So let's actually go to edit mode here, hit G to move our mesh but not move our object, and then go to object mode, and then go to object, set origin, origin to geometry, and it'll snap right back. So that's a really handy command to know. You can also place the origin at the 3D cursor if you really want to. So if we use our 3D cursor tool and place this somewhere on our mesh here, we can also go to object, set origin, and origin to 3D cursor. And that's helpful sometimes too. I'll go back to my box select tool here, and let's look at one other way to move our object origin. I'll use my move gizmo here to make this a little bit more clear. And what I want to do is just move the object itself without moving any of the components inside of it, which is kind of a weird trip if you think about it, because it's like moving the object and then going into edit mode and then moving all of our points back in the opposite direction in the exact same amount. But I want to do that without having to think about all of that, and so what I can do is just go to the options up here at the top right and go down to Effect Only Origins. Now when I move this around, it'll move just the object origin and nothing else. We get these handy axes so that we can also see where we're rotating it if we want to change the local orientation of the object, again without visually changing the mesh that's inside of it. For now though, I'll go to my options and turn this back off. But while we're at it, we may as well look at these other two options because they're kind of fun too. If we choose Effect Only Locations, then of course if I hit G to change the location of something, then it moves as normal. But if I hit S, nothing happens, and if I hit R, nothing happens either. So why would this be useful? Well, it's actually really cool because we can take two objects, and you can see that we have two object origins here, one for this object and one for that one. And if I hit S to scale, instead of changing the actual, size of our objects, what it'll do is just scale between these 2 points, and it'll just scale between the object origins. So now our mesh doesn't change size, but they just kind of drift apart. So this gives us a kind of cool effect. And similarly, if we rotate this, let's say we want to spin them in the circle, we can hit R and Z to spin it along the Z-axis. And now the objects themselves aren't really rotating, but they're rotating around each other. So that's just kind of another helpful thing to know. But for now, I'll go to options and turn that back off. Similarly with parents, if we choose that, then if we parent two objects, actually let me turn that off for the example first. Let's parent the ring. Let's put it on top of the box. And then select the box with the floor by shift left clicking. And then if you remember from our previous video, we can hit Control P and set parent to object. Now if we move our box on our floor, this has been stuck to it because the cube object is the reference point. But now if I go to options and effect only parents, that's going to allow me to move the parent temporarily without moving the child. So that's helpful for just adjusting things without messing up everything else that it's attached to. But again, you probably won't have to use that one for quite a while, but it's a helpful thing to know. The one last thing that I want to talk about when it comes to edit mode is how to switch between modes using a pie menu. Instead of just using tab to toggle between edit mode and object mode, I often find it helpful to use the pie menu instead, which by default is set to Control Tab. So if you choose that and then hold those two buttons down, then I can move my mouse to the right and go to Edit Mode, Control Tab, hold that down and go to Object Mode. And I like this because it's extremely clear which mode I'm going to, and when you start working in some of these other modes that can be a little bit more confusing. But you'll see me use this a lot in future videos sometimes, so I want to show you my preferences here. If I go to Edit and Preferences, I'll go over to the Key Map tab and check on Tab for Pi Menu. And in most of my videos, I think I have this on, just because I find it so much more useful. But again, that's a personal preference thing, and since it's not the default, I won't be using it in this course. But if I have that on, then I can just hit Tab to bring up that Pi menu, and swipe left for Object Mode, or swipe right for Edit Mode. That way, if I ever want to go to Object Mode, I can just hit Tab, swipe left. If I want to go to Edit Mode, I can hit Tab and swipe right, regardless of what other mode I'm in. Because if I'm in one of these other modes, let's just go to Vertex Paint for now. And let's say I turn this off, so now Tab just toggles between Edit Mode. If I hit Tab, I'll go to Edit Mode, but then if I hit Tab again, I'll go back to Vertex Paint mode. Or if I'm in, let's say, Weight Paint mode, which, again, you don't have to know what any of these are quite yet. If I hit Tab, I'll go to Edit Mode. If I hit Tab again, it'll toggle it back into Weight Paint mode. So I like to be a little bit more clear about what I'm going to and from. So that's why I like to have Tab for Pi Menu on. So even if I am in one of these other modes, I know that if I hit Tab and swipe left, I'll always go to Object Mode. But again, that's personal preference, and for this course, I will have this off. Okay, so with all of that said, let's do one little exercise here before ending off the lesson that will use all the basic stuff that we've learned so far. Let's create a simple door that swings open. We don't have to create a door frame or make it fancy. We're just going to make a super simple swinging door. Well, to do that, let's select everything with A and just get rid of everything in the scene and start fresh. So I'll select everything and hit Delete. Then I want to create a cube, but my 3D cursor is way off into space over here. So to center that back, I'll go to Object, Snap, and Cursor to World Origin. I could also use the hotkey Shift S. Cursor to World Origin right down here. Then I'll make another cube. Shift A, Mesh, and Cube. Now I want to shape this into a more flat rectangle, like a door of course, so I'll hit Tab to go to Edit Mode, and in this case it would be a lot easier to work with faces, so I'll go to Face Select Mode, and to flatten this out along the Y-axis, I'll take the front face and the back face here, and instead of moving them individually, I'll just scale them both along the Y-axis. So if I hit S and then Y, and move my mouse inwards, that'll just flatten it out a bit. Once that's done, I'll take the top face, and I'll hit G and then Z to move it up along the Z-axis to make it a little bit taller. That's maybe a little bit too tall, somewhere around there. And then let's take the bottom face, hit G and Z, and move it upwards. Actually, I don't think that's quite tall enough, so let's move that up a little bit more. Again, you could use this with hotkeys, or you could do this with the Move tool. It doesn't really matter. So let's say this is all we want to do with our door. So we hit Tab to go to Object Mode, hit R to rotate and go around the Z, and unfortunately this of course isn't swinging by the hinges. So do you remember what we need to do? We just need to make sure that the object origin, that little orange dot, is where the hinges would be. So in this case I can hit Tab to go to Edit Mode, hit A to select everything, move it along the X-axis by going to G and then X, and making sure that orange dot is just to the left of the whole mesh. Alternatively, we could also have snapped the 3D cursor to that edge there at the bottom, and actually let's do that just for practice. Let's go to Edge Select Mode and select this edge here at the bottom, and that way the object origin will be exactly in the center of this corner here. And then to snap, we just need to go to Mesh, Snap, and Cursor to Selected. Again, also we could use Shift S. Then to get the origin over there, we need to go to Object Mode because the origin is an object property. So hit Tab, go to Object, Set Origin, and Origin to 3D Cursor. Now when I use my Rotate tool, or rotate this in any way along the Z-axis, now it's going to swing open and shut just like we were hoping. And one last note here when it comes to working with the different modes, and I think this door is actually a good example of this. I'll go back to my Move tool here so we can see the different axes. Right now we're working in the global orientation, but we learned before how we could switch this over to our local orientation, and now we can very handily move this door front and backwards in relation to itself if we need to. Or we could also clear this rotation just by hitting Alt-R and close the door. If we were to make that transformation in edit mode, then we wouldn't be able to do that. So let's say we hit Tab to go into edit mode here, and we wanted to rotate it just like it was before. We can hit A to select everything, hit R and then Z, and then hit G and Y to move it along the Y-axis. And now it looks exactly the same as it did before, but it's going to be a lot harder to position correctly now. If I hit Tab to go to object mode, even though I'm in the local orientation, since I made that change in edit mode, it didn't change the local orientation, and so I can't really push this back and forth along what I would expect its axis to be. And also there's no quick way to close the door beyond just manually trying to get it exactly right, and that's never fun. So what I would recommend doing instead, I'll just hit Control Z to undo all of this, is to model things straight on and rotate them in object mode so that you can keep that local orientation and work with it very easily. Again, that local orientation can be useful even in edit mode. So if I hit Tab and I want to pull this edge in a little bit, I'll go to my Move tool, pull this in. You know, that's really, really easy here. If I rotated this in edit mode, I'll hit R and then Z, rotate it back, then that x-axis is pointing in the wrong direction, and I can't do that. Now we'll talk about edge sliding and other things later, but just for now know that things are going to be a lot easier if you keep everything lined up and then rotate things in object mode. And since we want to keep the object origin in a sensible place, if I was placing this asset somewhere, I would also move it in object mode. The only one that kind of breaks the rule there is scale, but the reason for that we'll talk about in a later video. So definitely give this a little bit of practice. Maybe try making a set of double doors here or something else that swings along a hinge. And when you're feeling comfortable with the difference between edit mode and object mode, then jump on over to the next lesson.